Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Future of Denial podcast. I am joined today by Richard Seymour. He is a prolific political philosopher and journalist and has written a wonderful book called The Twittering Machine and most recently, I believe, The Disenchanted Earth. He's also the editor of Salvage. Richard, would you like to tell us anything else about yourself?
Yeah, I should say I'm just one of the editors of Salvage.
One of the editors, yes.
Rosie Warren is the editor-in-chief, and we'll defer to her. I'm one of the founding editors, you might say, and I contribute something to its overall intellectual project. I think the other thing I would like to say is I've got a new book coming out in October called Disaster Nationalism, which actually resonates with some of the themes that you've been talking about, Tad, particularly in Against, which, interestingly, it's a shame for it to be pigeonholed as a kind of book about religion or evangelicals. It's really about incipient far-right politics, nationalism, and also theology and everything else as well. And that sort of fascinated me, and it was useful in helping to frame some of the ideas and arguments in this book. So that's something I'm working on, or rather that's something that's done and is coming out soon. Includes now a whole chapter on the Gaza genocide, which I wrote hastily over the last few months, because what could be more of a meat exemplar of the horrifying trends that we're seeing in the world today, from Brazil to the Philippines to Hungary to the United States and India, than what's happening in Gaza right now.
Yes, absolutely. Well, thank you for that. The discussion that I put in the final two chapters of my book, Future of Denial, on Gaza, it was actually the very last change that we made was sort of a discussion because I wrote the Gaza section more than a year and a half ago before I turned in the manuscript. And I was fascinated with the sort of morbid carelessness and cruelty expressed through things like not just the blockade of food and medical supplies, but the use of very kind of crass, uninterested in human life border technology, right? The fence, not a true border, of course, but the fences are lined with these turrets who theoretically have a man in the loop, but the man in the loop might be an 18-year-old kid that's deciding whether on an iPad to target and blow someone up. They also have these rover sentry drones for a long time discussing the climate crisis and the migrations. I would refer to the possibility of border sentry drones, and I would always kind of get these, these smirks sometimes from friends who would come on, that's not possible. And I wanted to say, no, this is already in the world. Gaza is a testing ground for brutal military equipment. They have these little rover drones. They have several different types, and they are theoretically programmed to make kill decisions automatically. And I think we can kind of guess where that's going with this whole explosion of so-called artificial intelligence, and of course Israel using this perversely named system, the gospel, the good news, kind of a very kind of like taking back a term from the Christians for the worst possible use, the gospel being this program that selects targets to, presumably give some plausible deniability to the murder.
Oh God, and that's been. You're absolutely right. That's in the world, and it's been actively driven, and it has been particularly by the U.S. military since about 2004. The idea is to get a technology where there's no man in the loop. That's the ideal. They want it to be possible to trust machines to take these targeting decisions, which of course require, even if you want some elementary efficacy. Never mind humanity, war crimes, all of that. Just on its own grounds, even to be minimally efficacious, you need to apply something called common sense, which of course artificial intelligence doesn't have and can't use. These are powers of discrimination that humans have, and so it's a really terrifying and threatening thing. And I agree with you. I think we should be looking at Gaza. For some weird reason, Palestine, and particularly Gaza, has become a kind of symptom of the world order at the moment. Anyway,
Yeah, I think Gaza kind of shows you how the genocide can happen in full view, with full-throated support of from liberal governments as well. This is not just a reactionary right-wing thing that we're looking at, right? And I think especially in addition from just the grotesque military violence, Gaza gives you a picture of what it looks like to administer a starvation. And I think as the population balloons up to close to 10 billion, and we find that capital finds a large number of people superfluous in the world as far as from the standpoint of the production of value, we're going to increasingly face a future in which it is simply considered too costly or not efficient to feed 10 billion stomachs, or perhaps even 8 billion once the crop yield starts really noticeably depreciating, which, of course, the crop yields are dropping at something like, well, depending on who you ask, anywhere from 3 or 7% to 10% or more per degree warming. So,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. And you can imagine how populations would be criminalized in the way that Gazans have been. So that, even trying to get yourself fed would be a criminal action. Maybe the canary in the coal mine here was Katrina, when, if you remember, people did try and feed themselves. They tried to get food. And if the media covered it in such a way that if they were white, they were recovering food, and if they were black, they were stealing or looting food.
Right.
Yes, there's a lot to unpack there, but it's a terrifying scenario, all the more terrifying given that, as you say, liberalism has turned out to be fully signed up for this. I mean, I want to differentiate between at least two souls of liberalism. There's Biden, who is desiccating and sociopathic and completely indifferent to the fate of the Palestinians and the migrants that he's now targeting. But then, of course, there's quite a big chunk of liberal opinion which is represented by NGOs, human rights organizations, which are quite shocked. And even some Western governments have been shocked by how terrifying this has become. Someone like Macron, who is, in other respects, an enemy, coming out for a ceasefire quite early. So there's these interesting fractures or fissures within liberalism. Anyway, I know we're going to come to the question of the liberals and what do they want.
Yes, yeah. Well, let's back up for a moment and just think: how is it that we came into contact? We've been, I think, more or less in touch for 5 years or so through each other's writing, and this is our first time actually speaking to each other for everyone to see here. So, where exactly did we come into contact?
Right. So I have a feeling that China Mieville, my friend and the author, pointed me to a podcast. Probably it was the Magnificast, which you appeared on, and said this is interesting, and I thought, oh, fuck yeah, that's interesting. Okay, so then I hunted down your Patreon and subscribed and listened kind of obsessively to your various talks and so on. There was one that you gave on the Proud Boys and the relation between pride and a defense against shame, which I thought was very useful. And actually, when I came to look at how, for example, Hinduva nationalism works in India, the pogromist right, and the way in which they, invert shame into pride. They have these Hindu pride rallies shortly after they've just massacred thousands of Muslims in Gujarat. And this was a carnival of ecstatic frenzy. The stuff that happened there, I'm not even going to bother describing it. I do talk about it in Disaster Nationalism, and the details are horrifying and macabre, as Edward Weisbrand refers to it as the macabresque. Then, shortly after, they have these Hindu pride rallies talking about Modi saying how if we can have have pride in ourselves, then all the malevolence of the Alis, Malis, and Jamalis will not do us any harm. He's obviously referring to the Muslims who have just been massacred and raped and tortured and all the rest of it. And so pride is doing something there because it basically drove up the BJP's vote, which had been expected to collapse. The BJP was in big trouble in this state because there had just been an earthquake. They handled it terribly. They were actually incredibly incompetent. They were also kind of hard-nosed in that businessman fashion that Modi likes. But after the pogrom, the share of the vote went up, particularly around the areas where the pogrom happened. That's pride. And I found that your sort of psychoanalytic take on this was very useful because there are limits. I mean, I can't not think with Marxism, but the Marxism has very definite limits. And I think one of those limits is where there are forms of irrationality that can't be subsumed into the picture that we get from, say, Capital or the Grundrisse or Engels' writings about real abstractions and the way our intentions are inverted and returned to us in a perverse form by social relations. This is something else, and this requires a look at the unconscious. So I found that very useful. And then I think I remember you wrote to me and said, why are you following me, dude? I can't remember. And then I think we had some chats since then. And also Sebastian Budgeon, who's over at Verso, asked me about you because he was very curious. Obviously, he's Sebastian's an intensely curious person who sort of reaches out into all fields.
He's been very wonderful, yes, yeah.
Oh yeah, sure, absolutely, and I imagine he would. He likes your work very much. So that's how it started for me.
Right, yeah, and I think I think we're to pick up on the why are you following me thing. I've been kind of in this very kind of theoretical niche as kind of like a very kind of small fish, just kind of looking at this one area of psychoanalysis and evangelicalism and American reactionary politics. And yes, I'm very interested in how, I think I present in against this you can think of almost like a spectrum of shame to indifference, and at both ends the person shuts up, right? They shut their, because shame is the worst thing to feel, right? The subject will do anything to avoid it, and they certainly will not talk about the thing that they feel most deeply ashamed of and convinced is true. And then on the other hand, if you're indifferent about something, you will also not talk about it because you just don't care. And it's in that middle space of turmoil and anxiety, as Lacan describes, that you generate your symptoms and repressions and so forth. And it's very kind of on the surface, and especially just to kind of like back away from just the sort of the vulgar Marxian take of everything kind of being reduced to class. There is in psychoanalysis, there's the libidinal drives. There's too many things that subjects want in aggressive, sadistic or masochistic, anxious ways that don't simply map on to what is in my best interest. In fact, I try to make this argument that actually people kind of get quite a bit of pleasure out of doing the sadism as cover for the primary drive of masochism. Sometimes it seems to be the case that people are primarily interested in doing what is worse for them, and they will do the sadism as kind of a rational cover for their sort of more destructive impulses. Yes, but I was just kind of amazed. I think that somebody who was further down the road and had kind of a more established following and had written a lot more than I had. I was very kind of pleased to make that connection, and I distinctly remember the morning that I woke up to Sebastian emailing asking if I had a project that might be suitable for Verso. This was I think October or November of 2020, so it was the pandemic year. Everything felt like it was falling apart. I had this weird space of immense joy in my life because my firstborn child had been born over the summer, but I was very concerned about, am I ever going to get a teaching position? Is anything going to work? Is the world going to end here? And I, in very short order, I got my first full-time teaching appointment, and Sebastian, kind of in the same week or so, reaches out and asks asks about this project, yes, and mentions you in China speaking about my work, and so that was that's been going on. That's more than 4 years ago, and I was 33 at the time, and I just turned 38. So I also feel like it's a big chunk of my 30s have just been dedicated full time to trying to learn everything I can about this crisis and sort of fit it into a schema that I was trying to develop before around reactionary politics and faith. So it has been a long road, and I'm quite excited to see it out.
What you say about the inefficacy of explanations based on self-interest, we're seeing that right in front of us now in Gaza, because what has happened in Israel? The Israeli economy's tanked. 20% reduction in GDP, 27% reduction in consumption, massive reduction in imports and exports, government spending up 88%, indebtedness, etc. Nothing matters more than destroying Amalek. The satisfactions of, I guess to use William Connolly's phrase, existential revenge, now channeled into this project. This is not amenable to an interest-based analysis, and so much of what's going on in the world today, unless we broaden our conception of what is interesting, of what an interest can be, because social being, meaning, these can be interests as well, maybe we need to broaden the repertoire.
Yes, no, I'm glad that you brought this back to Gaza, because one of the things that just drives me insane about the question of whether or not, every discussion of the genocide is brought back to, will you first condemn what Hamas did on October 7th, right? And lost in that seems to never be, well, okay, let's say I was to hypothetically, I'm not, but let's say I was to hypothetically, would you condemn what Israel did on October 7th? Because we now know quite clearly that Israeli Apache helicopters were attacking the people, it looks like, or there was indiscriminate destruction in various places with, platoons kind of out close to Gaza that were, it looks like firing on their own people, right? And so some negligible number of casualties actually came from the Israeli military itself attacking itself. And it seems almost as if, in order to cover for that self-destructive tendency, one has to completely annihilate another.
Yeah, and also, the point of questions like that, we used to get that around ISIS, but do you condemn ISIS? Do you condemn the people who killed the guys at Charlie Hebdo and whatever else? The point of the question is to imply that there's a question. To imply that you might be a bit suspect. You might be one of those weird, fanatics and whatever else. It's in terms of the dominant ideology of the era. It's becoming, as you say, more overt as well. Everything's in our face. It's not like things are covered up. It used to be, I remember Iraq and the shock of Abu Ghraib, and various things that were happening in Iraq. It was shocking because it was exposed and people hadn't known that it was happening. Well, now you can just get it on Telegram and Twitter, or X, nay Twitter. One of these platforms, it's just in your face. And the only thing that's really happening now is it's treated as though it's just not really relevant. It's like the only kind of people who are exercised by such things are weirdos, probably anti-Semitic. You might have a bit of concern for the number of children who are dying, but anybody who's really paying attention to what's really going on in there has to have some sort of agenda. So the evidence doesn't matter. Right,
yeah. Let's shift gears for a moment and think about the upcoming horror on the horizon, the ecological crises in their various forms, which I want to kind of say that I think one of the things that I love about your book, The Disenchanted Earth, is that you have this discussion of how the environmental movement itself, by collapsing into just a kind of focus on climate change has kind of made it a more liberal space, whereas traditionally reactionaries and fascists too have really loved environmental spaces, especially in the 70s, 80s, and so forth, when it was about conservation of the land. Right, this is one of your arguments for why the silo shifted into a very kind of liberal technocratic space, and part of that is kind of so this broader kind of concern where the environmental crises we face, which include biodiversity loss, right, that kind of gets occluded in just thinking about temperature, right, even though they're clearly related. So let's think about. I mean, so we've discussed a little bit about psychoanalysis, and maybe there's more to get in there, right? But I'm very interested in how psychoanalysis gives us different categories of denial, the vicissitudes of repression, the concept of fetish disavowal. They each work in different ways, right? And repression is not the same as sublimation or turning around on its opposite, and so forth. I make quite a big deal out of a short paper of Freud's on negation, or which is a type of denial, where he kind of says, when the repressed is beginning to surface, people will kind of respond in a very small number of ways, right? On the one hand, you can, if a repressed idea is coming to the surface, you can negate it by kind of saying that's not real and just deny reality. Or you can distance yourself from some sort of moral culpability. You can acknowledge that the thing is coming to the surface, but say that was not my fault, right? And I think it's very interesting how in like the sort of the conservative liberal bipolarity gives us major parties that can kind of operate according to whichever mode of denial we would prefer, right?
Right.
But I don't. Of course, there was Lacan's question with anxiety is always, what does the other want, right? Like, what am I supposed to do? What am I supposed to desire? And that is the question always on the surface of the climate conversation, right? Like, what am I supposed to do, right? Is there something I can really do? And the answers are, the standard answer is the carbon footprint is a bit of a sham. It's not nothing, but it is, it's a marketing tool and so forth. The real answers are going to be things like, well, have you considered the MOM method, or on the other hand, have you considered showing up to your local zoning board and talking about implementing heat pumps instead of gas furnaces, and like the actual things that you can do, in other words, are either so extreme or so ordinary that it just kind of boggles the mind. And you talk about this in the Disenchanted Hearth, we are given less agency than ever, and it produces this uncanny feeling. I think you link it to the uncanny, if I recall. I don't know if you had any more to say about that, or if it might be better to switch over to environmental humanities, IPCC. But do you have anything that you wanted to kind of say about how you view in your work psychoanalysis giving us an extra set of tools before we shift over?
Yeah, well, in terms of, we started off there with talking about desire. And one of the things that we can say, a commodity is supposedly an anticipated desire. But one of the things that you said there very clearly is desire is linked to the other. What am I supposed to desire? What am I supposed to want? And of course, we have whole industries designed to precisely tell you that, to give you some direction. And so there's a sense in which there are different kinds of denial at stake here in terms of, you talked about negation and different modalities of negation. But there's a kind of denial which is, I would interpret as a kind of thwarted mourning, which is I don't want to face up to the difficulty that poses because it's too difficult, it's too overwhelming, and I've got too much shit to deal with in my own life, as if this isn't in your own life. And René Lertzman's work on environmental melancholia, which included some field work dealing with people who lived near a lake that had just been polluted and destroyed, found that there was actually beneath the surface of apathy, of being like, I don't pay attention to any of that stuff. Very quickly it developed into, I used to go down there when I was a kid and had a great time, and people had all sorts of unconscious associations with the wildness, the natural world that they had experienced. And there was a kind of occluded sadness and sense of loss. And to me, where psychoanalysis can also be useful, apart from guiding us through mourning and out of melancholia, because the work of mourning is actually an essential part of it, but it's not where you want to end up, is that what is the mourning for? Because if you I like to say mourning is a gift. As soon as you can mourn for something, that means that you are in love with it. If you are able to mourn for the world, the planet, then something in that is intensely important to you. And I think that that's a better motivation than liberal technocratic guilting strategies like carbon footprint, for example, that you mentioned. Right. I think, and there's often an insinuation that mourning is a kind of white gloom dude kind of sort of indulgence. Really not true. Solastalgia and the whole area of environmental melancholia and mourning and etc. began with work on indigenous communities in Australia and then in Iceland and so on. Not Iceland, sorry, Greenland. And there, out of that has developed the idea of different types of mourning that might be useful here. But the point is, it's to wire into what is going to get you out of bed and want to do something, because the feeling of being overwhelmed is not going to get you out of bed. The feeling of being... I think there's a difference between responsibility and blame. And sometimes we tend to conflate these two things. We're all to some extent to blame, but that's not really the point. The point is what can we be responsible for? And enabling us to be responsible subjects is one of the things that psychoanalysis is very useful for too, meaning responsible for our division and responsible for our desires, some of which are actually, desires that we would not prefer to acknowledge. But quite importantly, the unconscious is not an ally. It doesn't, it's not necessarily reactionary or progressive or anything like that. It's just, it's not an ally. So what you unconsciously may wish for or think about, your unconscious axioms really don't have much to do with what's good for you or the planet or anything like that.
Sure.
And so when we look at how the commodity works to offer us a kind of substitute satisfaction. Actually, start before the commodity, but like money, the money commodity, right?
Sure.
There's people find it harder these days, Adam Phillips once said, to talk about money than they do about sex. It's very easy to talk about sex now because we're all kind of supposedly literate in our sexuality, even though there's always a point at which that breaks off. But money is a source of guilt and evasions and anxiety, particularly because it relates to things like class and social hostility and so on. So people find it very difficult to talk about, but also because money is ultimately, a displacement for, well, in one version of the story, it's a displacement for incestuous desire. Which, that's a very sort of, you might say that's Freud's Oedipal dream, in Lacan's terms. Okay, but it's obviously related in some sense to prohibition. And so money offers, on the one hand, a sense of omnipotence. I will pay you, and you will give me what I want, and I will be satisfied. And in so many areas of life, that's just not how it works. You can pay for a service, and quite a lot of services can't promise satisfaction, whether it's psychoanalysis or sex work, which are very similar kind of vocation if you think about it. And so, because neither of them can guarantee satisfaction, it depends on you. Yeah. So there's a sense in which the sort of commodity form is structured around the idea of something impossible, which is a guarantee. It is, maybe in that sense, it goes back to the fetishistic disavowal that you were talking about. I don't know. So I find various aspects of psychoanalytic theory, while mostly I would sort of want to insist that psychoanalysis is designed for the clinic, the individual clinic, and it doesn't really make much sense outside of the one-by-one situation, or at least if you're going to extract it from the one-by-one situation of the cell of the clinic, you're going to have to do something to adapt it and justify it, or put in some mediating concept. But nonetheless, with that in mind, it's very hard not to see. First of all, practically every psychoanalyst, who was a major innovator, had stuff to say about wider social problems and the relationship of psychoanalytic concepts to them.
Caution is always about not trying to deploy this by just trying to strictly make sense out of, is Biden a hysteric or a pervert or something like that? Like that is not helpful, right? But to think about broad social systems and like what does it look like when a death drive is desirous of too many things at once, starts to become quite a bit more helpful. Yes.
Yeah, but actually, when you think about what capitalism is as a system. We Marxists call ourselves materialists, and yet we rarely ever are talking about matter. What we're talking about most of the time, in fact, almost every step we make is to idealize what is presumed to be something material. In other words, we either sort of socialize it, we make it to be something to do with social relations, which is just the communion of consciousness. So something that's not particularly material at all, something that's not tangible. Or we historicize it, which is sort of intergenerational sort of process in which consciousness is formed in the direction of more capacity for freedom and therefore more capacity for moral behavior. This really doesn't have anything to do with materialism in any metaphysical sense anyway. So when we think about what capitalism is, we're talking about it as a kind of spiritual machine. It is a particular configuration, a social configuration of intentions. So our intentions are brought together and mediated through particular institutions, particular agreements, reflecting forms of power and in a complicated and contradictory relationship with the material limits and the material mediums. But it's not in itself a material thing. And that's where it can start to resemble the death drive, because it just spins on regardless of its biophysical limits. It has no sort of concept of that. Everything is just assumed to be, as Jason W. Moore writes, a free gift. It's usurped as something that's just there. It's just a given. And, in a lot of traditional ecological discourses, there's the idea of the earth as, and particularly in certain right-wing theological discourses, the earth is just an inexhaustible bounty. I forget the cornucopia discourse, and so capitalism as a fundamentally as an ideal system, and as one that engages our intentions in a particularly perverse way, so that individually we may not wish to contribute to the climate crisis, but our intentions are collectivized in a particular way, for which we're all differently responsible, and it comes back in this perverse format, and I suppose that means that there are points of contact. I would suggest possibly more points of contact between Marxism and psychoanalysis than Lacan thought when he argued that basically the only point of contact is the symptom, the logic of the symptom.
Yeah, in a sense. Yeah, I'm reading Seminar 16 right now, and there's a very he makes a big deal about a homology between the object of desire, the objet, and the object of surplus value in capitalism. And he actually, he makes this very interesting case that he doesn't mean this as an analogy. He means that they are the same thing. That the object of desire he's talking about is the same as in capitalism surplus value. and it's a rational desire. It's something that you have to be told to desire, right? Like you have to have this pre-existing market, and you have to have kind of a more or less functional law of capitalist accumulation in order to desire surplus value, or if I'm just an upstart entrepreneur, so to speak. But yeah, it's a very interesting connection, and more than Lacan probably had in mind.
Yeah, actually, as you talked about Seminar 16, I was asking my partner, who's doing the CFAR training, can you explain jouissance to me? And this is what she pointed me to, this section on surplus jouissance and surplus value. And I do find that very suggestive, and much more so now that I've undertaken, again, partly under the influence of China Mieville, this idealist turn in terms of interpreting Marxism as basically a form of idealism that is in denial, about its predicates. But insofar as once you start to make sense of, you start to realize that when we talk about material, frequently we're not talking about something that is actually material in a physical sense. We're talking about something that has acquired a certain objectivity through social agreement, and that's what we call material. And, in a sense, that's what the traditional idealist philosophers would say matter was. It's basically mind more or less objectified. And so this is, what capital essentially is. There's nothing physical about it, but it acquires a certain materiality. Well, in the same way, we could talk about the drive. Insofar as Lacan said the drive is a montage, involving, a response to need and demand, and the sort of the contrived and imaginary solutions to those problems. And insofar as we no longer have people being formed in very small households with a handful of adults as their emotional bonds, but in units in societies where they're basically penetrated by screens, by surveillance devices, and all of this is for the production of commodity desire. All of this is for commerce, and TikTok. All this xenophobia about TikTok is completely beside the point. If you actually pay attention to what's going on TikTok, it's mostly designed for influencers, and they want to do that better than Instagram. So that's how the drive is being formed currently. Through or how it's being digitalized, I suppose we should say. Right.
Yes. Yeah. An interesting point to add there, where Lacan, I believe this is in Seminar 11, but I could be wrong about that, where he makes a comment, a very quick comment about how all drives, in his view, function virtually as death drives. And
yes.
It's an interesting way to put it, that all the drives are functionally, or virtually, specifically virtually, death drives.
It's always, a drive is always a virtualization. And this is why, it's a big mistake to talk about the death instinct, because there's no scientific foundation for such an instinct. But there's always a virtualization going on when we start talking about any psychoanalytic concept, which is why it's useful as an ally against bourgeois materialism as well. Because bourgeois materialism, particularly in its social Darwinist form, tends to naturalize, I suppose we might want to interrogate the category of nature and naturalism as ideologically loaded in itself, but it tends to naturalize things that are historical or socially produced. I think, just as I can't think without Marxism, I now can no longer think without some recourse to psychoanalysis. And I'm the sort of person, I don't know what you're like, Tad, but I get fascinated and almost obsessed with a particular way of thinking, and then eventually it lets go of me for a while, and I can take a more secular approach and start looking at other angles as well. And so with Lacanian analysis, I started off by doing an analysis maybe 10 years ago. And I had to apply it to everything and had to read everything, except Lacan. You're going to read everything except Lacan. Read Bruce Fink. Read whoever. Do not read Lacan, because Lacan is impossible.
Yeah, I started off on the opposite. I encountered Freud in undergrad doing psychology, but Freud's one day in a theories class in an American psychology department. Didn't really get into it until I was doing my first master's in theology, and I felt like just reading Seminar 11 on the four fundamental concepts gave me a language to talk about some of the stuff that I was doing in theological study. But I had lost my faith by that point, but I was still very kind of interested in the homology between some of these terms and that I was studying in the classroom and that Lacan was giving me. And then, without going into too much detail, my life just kind of fell apart. I went through a terrible breakup. I was terribly depressed, and I medicated through the completely perverse way of just working through everything of Lacan's that I could find published, and that was kind of my way to kind of work through, and I made my first book out of that project, right? That I had just kind of disciplined myself to waking up every morning at 4 or 5 a.m. and working on my Lacan and taking my notes, and then it has become the background to everything that I've done since. Although this book is kind of notably Lacan is much more in the background and Marx is much more in the foreground than in my previous work. I do like that you mentioned this melancholy a few minutes back, and that was actually the original subtitle of my book was going to be Climate Change and Melancholia. I ended up kind of changing directions on what I wanted to talk about, but I do like this notion that Freud has that melancholia, unlike guilt, which usually, real or imagined, has a thing that it thinks it needs to pay for, right?
Yeah.
Not necessarily something it actually did wrong, but something that's functioning at the imaginary tier. Melancholy, on the other hand, seems to work almost more like a cathexis, something that somebody has attached to that they feel is in themselves that they can't necessarily externalize. I mean, people get melancholic about, you mentioned, like about just an idea or a memory, right? And melancholia, we talk about climate anxiety. But really what's going on is a lot of climate melancholia. It is the correct, I would argue, judgment that we have lost this world, and that the changes on the horizon are unlike anything that we can really fathom, and that we are going to burn through our fossil fuel reserves, and that this is going to have consequences. And to kind of get it back to where does that intersect with guilt? I kind of mentioned, like, I live in a world where in order to get groceries, I have to drive my car over to a grocery store and emit carbon dioxide that will still, a portion of it, about a fifth of it, will still be in the atmosphere in 500,000 years, driving the extinction of organisms that have not yet evolved. And that's just my day, right? I'm just going about killing things 500,000 years into the future all day long. And there's really no way around that within the limits of what I am handed, right? And that is precisely the case. But yeah, maybe we could, unless you had something more that you wanted to jump in on, I wanted to kind of get your take on, one of my big convictions is that climate change is an immensely interdisciplinary problem. Unlike anything, Marx has this line once where he says, the natural scientists kind of like show their limits when they start to venture out beyond what they actually study, right, into the domain of political philosophy or culture or something like that, right? They really kind of show that they're very good experts in a certain field, but if you want to talk about things that you've never studied, you kind of start to trip over yourself really quickly. And what I have noticed is that there are sometimes high profile, on TV a lot, climatologists, for example, who really, really know their field, but will start talking about political solutions and they'll be quite facile. Just vote blue no matter who, and that's what we're going to do. And no reading of political philosophy or even history often, to say nothing of psychoanalysis. And it's my conviction. One thing that I really wanted to do was not speak out of turn. I wanted to really, really learn the fields that I don't know, because it so frustrates me when others do the exact opposite. And this climate crisis is just something that is interdisciplinary at a level that nobody can have a degree that authorizes you to speak, right? Even if we believed in such things, right?
Right.
And so, and specifically the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, they have their 3 working groups. The first working group that usually comes out with their report first is on the physical sciences. What is radiative forcing? What's energy imbalance? Exactly how much of each molecule is contributing this amount of warming and so forth. And And then after that comes the working group on vulnerability and adaptation, which I consider probably the most important work from a humanitarian perspective, right? Like, how do we save people? And that's where many of the social sciences are packed. And then finally, you have the third working group on mitigation that does all of the modeling. And that's where there's no broad, so far as I can tell, there's no broad sustained interaction with humanities discourses, environmental or so forth. They're not even at the level of political philosophy, right? The most you get are what is called socioeconomic pathways, which imply a certain type of political philosophy, but don't really spell it out. So, for example, the only option that the IPCC tells us that we have for staying beneath 1.5 degrees in most modeling scenarios, the only option we have for below 2 degrees is more or less a scenario, it's called shared socioeconomic pathway 1. It implies more or less a rapid development on a model of an overnight, more or less over the next decade or so, transition to global social democracy, right? Sort of like on a Scandinavian model type, like high development, high equality, egalitarian society, and so forth, plus perhaps hundreds of trillions of dollars in carbon capture and other types of mitigation spending over the next century. And that doesn't come through to people, right? Like when you read a report in the news and scientists say that, keeping temperatures under 1.5 or 2 degrees according to the Paris, commitments requires us to, take these policy solutions. What comes through is not, we are talking about a massive revampment, unlike anything imaginable in the next decade or so. And I constantly, I guess to kind of wrap up what I'm saying here, I constantly feel like there are so many spaces for everyone to kind of plug in on dozens and dozens of different fields, and I feel constantly frustrated that there is just not more interdisciplinarity, especially among the powers that be that sort of guide these discourses, whether in the scientific community or in what Andreas Malm calls the climate capitalist governance apparatus, the sort of liberal side of this. I don't know if you have any thoughts toward that end.
I mean, yes, I think that's. I have been more interested in the other side of that, which is the indifference of parts of the left in the physical sciences, the biological sciences, and so on. More because this is, I think, this is due to. For a long period of time, there was a sense that climate was possibly, at worst, a distraction. And at best, subsidiary. I mean, we focus on the revolution first, and then we'll deliver the plan for climate action. And obviously, as climate becomes more and more of an urgency, and really, I think we just need a better term than climate change or whatever, because, as you say, biodiversity is extinction is crucial to this. And I think, to me, this matters for reasons that aren't captured by the classical sort of utilitarian logic. Well, we kind of need these food chains to exist, or the aesthetic reasoning that we actually need to enjoy nature and yada yada yada. No, these species are universes of consciousness. They are universes of experience, of reality knowing itself and striving towards itself, which will never ever be replaced. And it's impossible for us to know what it's like. For example, the emperor penguin is going extinct, and we all know all the reasons why. And the emperor penguin has an extraordinary mode of existence. I'm sure you like the David Attenborough documentaries don't even get to get beneath the surface. Like the ways in which they have sex by playing cock on hen on the ice, the ways in which they swim, their particular experience of swimming, their flattening eyes. They have a whole different a different sensorium, and presumably a very different mental apparatus. Whatever we can say about the relationship between brains and minds and so on, we can certainly say that the brain is a medium of mind, as is the whole body. and that there's something unique and original and irreplaceable there, and it will be gone forever. And I'm also not enchanted by the idea of, well, let's save some of their DNA so we can, remake it at some point. Like,
Park it, yeah.
yeah, I think they tried to do this with a northern white rhino or something. And no, it's not the same. Okay, it's fine, but it's not the same. You've lost it. We've all lost it. And so this really is something I think we on the left should be taking more seriously. I was shocked recently. I was in a meeting where someone who I'd spoken to, and we agreed on quite a lot, and respected one another. But he said something like, "Well, like there are extinctions all the time on the planet, and the animals generally sort themselves out. So I suppose what we need to focus on is civilization." No, motherfucker, we need to focus on everything, the whole planet, and the whole of living conscious existence, because it is incredibly fragile, and it's valuable anyway. Sorry for ranting.
I mean, it makes me think. The Permian extinction 250 million years ago.
Yeah.
The fastest extinction outside of the impactor that killed the dinosaurs. It happened because of too much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It essentially got too hot, and 95% of species were eliminated. And we are injecting carbon dioxide about 100 times faster, right? Like even if we were just talking about biodiversity loss, it is something that we don't have a relatable analogy to. Even a geologist in deep time does not really have an analogy to what we are currently doing.
Oh yeah, and I mean, never mind that we might destroy the conditions for our own existence as a species.
Yeah. That's the big question. Yeah, right.
It's not impossible we could destroy ourselves. Chomsky used to say, perhaps we're a non-viable species, and he referred to the nuclear threat. There's all sorts of ways in which we could finish ourselves off. And again, tragically, because all of it is so unnecessary. But I think the other side of this is that sometimes the scientists are brutally honest and extremely enlightening. Like there's a physicist called Sabine Hostenfelder who is kind of interesting. She's sort of a YouTuber who does mostly physics, but recently did talk about certain changes that are happening in sort of glacial formation, ice and its melting, and the patterns that are happening there, and just really sort of digging into the ecological literature and pointing out how terrifying it all is, and then ended up by saying, well, what we need urgently is for us to elect sensible governments who will implement the correct policies. We certainly don't need anything like degrowth or any of that nonsense. And I just think there's Althusser used to talk about the spontaneous ideology of the scientists, and maybe we need to revisit that, because there does seem to be something in the habitus, the mode of existence of the practitioner of biological, of the life sciences, I think we should say, but not just, which habituates one to a kind of technocratic reason.
Right. You want a subject who's supposed to know, or a manager supposed to arrest, or something like that.
Yeah,
so to speak.
Which is liberalism in a nutshell, right?
Right. Yes. Yeah. And plenty more I wanted to get to on liberalism, but I want to kind of draw our time to a close. I certainly think that there is so much to explore with the ways that the liberal owning class and the conservative owning class have their different schemas, and one is one that we may be able to prod some short-term, at least for the sake of the vulnerable for, but ultimately opposed against our interest. And in my book, and I've gone back and forth with you, of course, on some of your writing about the Corbyn platform that was squashed in 2019, and then a few months after, Sanders also, in each of our countries, the largest climate plans that had ever been proposed were squashed in very, very short order, with some similar accusations and sort of misdirections kind of going on. So much to explore there as kind of a political inaction of denial by people who perhaps call themselves science believers and have a yard sign that says, "In this house we believe in science," and so forth. There is so much more to explore. But Richard, thank you so much for all of your time. This has been wonderful. Is there anywhere else people can find you, or anything else you want to plug?
Yeah, I think I would like to plug my Patreon, because that's how I make most of my money these days.
Yes. I will say I am a patron. The writing is some of the most. It is eerily close to the thing that I am worried about, that I feel like I am not getting the full story on each week. And I really, really think you are a wonderful, wonderful journalist, and you've been doing just an immense amount of work on Gaza recently. So thank you for that. Yes, I highly recommend that.
Thank you so much for that. So yeah, please come and subscribe. Don't just subscribe and take the free option. I need the money. So thank you. Thank you, Tad.
Yeah. Well, I think I subscribed actually when I was actually drawing on some of your work behind the paywall for my book specifically. So it's some of your research and reporting has actually kind of filtered into my chapter on what this liberal wants, for sure. Is there anything else before we log off here?
No, I think you got it all. Subscribe to Salvage, and thank you so much.
Yes, subscribe to Salvage as well. Check that out. Okay, Richard, thank you so much for joining. I look forward to talking again. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you.